Beautiful. Let me commend your work by setting up this program, and particularly the title of the series under which this is conducted as Governance Index. It indicates that you hold governments to account and you keep track of what governments are doing in various respects. And peace and security is a very important one. I am going to follow the chronology, or rather the key topics, the key issues, the key words as given by you. The genesis, the politics, and the solution, which you said we shouldn't talk about now. I'll leave that to the end. Southern Kaduna crisis. Now, let me comment what my colleague, Dr. Hayab, said, the foundation he laid. I would want to take it to a broader level because my own doctorate research was in law, but it was multidisciplinary, bringing together history, peace building, constitutionalism, and so on. So, and I used the middle belt of Nigeria as a case study, Kaduna State being just one of the states I used. Now, the genesis of the Southern Kaduna crisis. I will trace the genesis, or rather I'll categorize it in two. First, the conceptual genesis, and then the practical application, the genesis of that. Now, the conceptual genesis of the Southern Kaduna crisis can be located within the broader framework of how Nigeria's middle belt was treated in colonial policies. And you'll find a lot of hints about that in Lord Lugard's, in the annual reports, most of which was written by Lord Lugard. Particularly, let me refer you to the one of 1900 to 1911, where you see a lot of details. And then to Lugard's dual mandate. So there's a book called The Dual Mandate of British Tropical Africa. And there's also the Tropical Dependency by Flora Shaw, where she actually gave Nigeria its name. Now, there was a dilemma about how to treat various identities. Diversity was a problem for the British people. So they came to this area, they met various ethnic groups with two broadly categorized, two civilizations, so to say, according to the British way of thinking, which I would call racist. So they saw the Muslims, whom they categorized as semi-civilized in what they call the science of the races. It's well established and well discussed by Friedrich Hegel, the philosopher. Now, in the science of the races globally are categorized into three: the civilized, the Europeans; the barbarians or semi-civilized, those who came under the influence of some sort of civilization, largely of the Ottoman Empire, but Muslim-based. So those are considered to be second, half civilized. Then the third category were called savages, the Africans, the South Americans, and so on. These were considered to be unworthy of recognition at all. So the only way forward for them was for them to be assimilated into one of the other two categories or subjugated in some other way. That is where the concept of the civilizing mission comes in. And that is why anywhere they went and they found those categorized as barbarians or savages, most especially savages particularly, they declared the land vacant, terra nullius, occupy it. So in Nigeria, it was not possible to bring sufficient British staff to have direct administration. So they used some indigenous structure. And of course, since the semi-civilized, the barbarians, the Muslims were categorized as superior to the savages, the indigenous Africans, a system was devised to, as much as possible, assimilate, bring the non-Muslim populations of the entire Middle Belt under Muslim rule. You see this repeated in the colonial reports, in the dual mandates, in the 1919 Lord Lugard's report on the amalgamation of Nigeria, in the Willing Commission's report of 1958, which defined the northern system as something based on the Emir, on Islam, on the four mainly Muslim ethnic groups of Kanuri, Hausa, Fulani, and Nupe. And then the other ethnic groups are considered peripheral. And then there was a direct policy of trying to subjugate them. So now their resistance is where the conflict can be traced to. Because each time an attempt was made to subjugate the non-Muslims to Muslim rule, They resisted. And this is because they were not really fully conquered by the jihad. When you go to page 77 of the annual reports of 1902, for example, it says the Fulani never thoroughly conquered the country. They only succeeded in gaining the submission of the great towns and plains where their horsemen were effective. The pagan tribes in the hills and broken country, and even in large areas of the plains, maintained their independence. They were constantly raided for slaves, and they retaliated by attacking the caravans and frequently carried the war up to the gates of the Fulani walled towns. And this ravaged the country. So if you want to trace the practical, we have now gone from the conceptual, telling you about how the science of the races shaped colonial thinking, to the practical, which is trying to subjugate non-Muslims to Muslim structures so that the North will be homogeneous, will be recognized as a Muslim territory. Mr. Host, for example, many people in Igbo land think that once you cross the Niger, you are in Muslim territories. So the identities of these diverse indigenous peoples were obscure, where Southern Kaduna falls. Now, when you go to Bauchi State, you find a similar pattern. When you go to Borno State, Southern Borno, a similar pattern across that way. Let me take you even to another country where a similar policy was applied. Sudan, Northern Sudan, with the Arab-based Muslim population, and South Sudan. And you see how that has played out. If you go to Rwanda, the Tutsis categorized as superior, the Hutus as inferior. So let me leave it at that. There's too much to say for this short period. Then the politics of it, I only mention one thing. Each side in what you call the crisis of Southern Kaduna plays the victim card a lot. There's a gentleman, Sanusi Mekudi, whom I saw his name earlier. I don't know how he disappeared. He talks about how many Muslims are being killed, and the Southern Kaduna people keep showing data, details, pictures, videos of mass killings along the lines of genocidal trends, I would say. Now, how do you understand the politics of victimhood? In my research, I found it problematic. Everyone is a victim, but you have to find a way of defining victims in a way that makes sense. So I came up with 4 different conceptions of victimhood. So I'll mention 2 of them. One, I call the dispossessed victim, who fights back. The dispossessed victim is the person against whom the system by default is set. The system is set to work against him. Then there is the favored victim, or the dispossessing identity victim. You mustn't be intrinsically evil. The system is set in such a way that if you belong to a particular religion or ethnic group, you are by default a dispossessing identity, set or positioned to take over what belongs to another. So the politics of victimhood is something that features in the way that the different sides articulate the conflict. Let me conclude by saying that as many scholars like Professor Shiv Viswanathan, my lecturer, and Boaventura de Sousa Santos said, we have these problems because there is a poverty of ideas on how to manage diversity. There is an overemphasis on the wrong and destructive notion of unity, homogeneous unity, which entails the extermination of the others. And when you trace every genocide in history, it is rooted in that defective way of thinking. Now we have moved beyond that in rhetoric, in language, the language of rights and equality. But we have not overhauled the faulty foundations upon which genocidal trends are being pursued. And there's a lot of scholarship on this. It baffles me how the leadership of this country cannot open its eyes and really open the floor for ideas to come and inspire a total overhaul of this very defective construct called Nigeria, whether in the south, east, southwest, in the middle belt, even in the far north, Zamfara, Katsina, and so on. People are just being killed. Something is fundamentally wrong. But let me pause here and wait for the time when you talk about solutions, because I have a book, my monograph, which is specifically and exclusively about that. And I have a lot to say on that. So thank you very much.
Wide reportage in the media about what is happening. It appears that the victims are sometimes reluctant to come out and speak about their experiences. Right from the time I picked interest in Southern Kaduna, I've had personal stories of people who underwent severe suffering. A guy told me about how his father went out to hunt in the bush, was arrested as a terrorist, tortured, killed. All his efforts to find out what happened to his father till date for the past 2 years have been fruitless, and several other stories like that. Then secondly, another thing I want to ask is this. There appears to be a discrepancy between what is exactly happening. I interviewed Senator Shehu Sani on this subject. Sani was saying that there are killings outside southern Kaduna as well. So if there are killings happening outside southern Kaduna as well, what is really happening in southern Kaduna? Is it communal conflict? Is it bandit attacks? Or are there terrorists being imported from elsewhere who are committing criminality and killing people? So if there is a speaker that will address this matter, please. Do you think that what is happening in southern Kaduna is, one, is it communal conflict? Even though it has been touched, but let us be clear about that. Is it communal conflict? Is it bandit attacks? Or terrorists coming in from Mali, Mauritania, and other places that is carrying out these killings in southern Kaduna? Dr. Kajit, please.
Thank you. Now, I'll address this question. You asked about what is happening. Is it banditry? Is it? Now, first of all, let me make it clear that different sides see what is happening differently. If you listen to the narrative of the group called Sokamuda, Southern Kaduna Muslims, their narrative is that they founded some towns in Southern Kaduna, and the other people that, according to them, call themselves indigenes, then came subsequently, and so on. Now, what they're trying to do by that narrative is to establish a paradigm of, because being indigenous has been recognized to be very important. So they're trying to establish a paradigm that falls in line with that. Meanwhile, the indigenes are totally dumbfounded by this very preposterous claim, because all history is it's overwhelmingly clear. The history of the Hausa states, whether you look at the narrative that talks about the Hausa Bokwe, Banza Bokwe, and when exactly the Fulanis migrated into the West African sub-region, Guinea, Senegal first, coming from North Africa, specifically the area that, because you see, this is the most comprehensive story you probably find about the Fulanis, the tropical dependency by Flora Shaw. She was not just the wife of Lugard, she was a scholar, a researcher, a historian, an anthropologist. And she has done the most extensive work I've seen about the Fulanis. So there's a very clear timeline about when they migrated into Senegal, Gambia, and when they came to northern Nigeria, Sokoto, Daura, and so on. And the Hausa states know exactly where the boundaries are. Now, this is where the confusion comes in the narrative of the Muslims. These towns that they claim they established, Katia, Zango, Kafanchan, and so on. Let me extend it to the Middle Belt. Wase, Nasarawa, Ilorin, and so on. Some of these places were there as either products of the jihad, like Ilorin, which was clearly the victory of Alini, with the conniving Yoruba general who defected. But in the case of Southern Kaduna, many of these places, Zango means a temporary place to stop over for travelers. Hausas were traders. There's an article written by this professor, Long Distance Trade. You see all those details there. So it was a stopover. But when the colonial masters came, when you read their accounts, you see that Hausa was very important to them. Islam was important to the colonial masters. So they needed to establish Muslim towns across the Middle Belt as centers for administrative control. So anywhere they found the smallest community that speaks Hausa language, that adheres to Islam, that is not pagan, which they abhorred, or savage as they call them, they elevated that place to a status where it could execute or be used as a site from which to administer the pagans. Now, let me refer you to a book you will find very, very interesting. This is called The Tailed Headhunters of Nigeria, an account of an official 7 years experiences. One of the British officers, Arthur Newman Tremaine, who was an administrator in the area, in a particular instance, he told about how he went to subdue a particular pagan tribe. I don't use the word tribe because they are nations by all definitions, having a language, an ancestral land, a culture, and so on. So upon return to Jama and Daroro, that's a Muslim town, the Muslims hailed him, were praising him and singing his praises for subjugating the infidels that they themselves could not defeat. So when you listen to the accounts of those who say the Muslim communities, Hausas, Fulanis, that say they founded towns in southern Kaduna, they do not go beyond 1900. They run parallel with the colonial experience. And that's where I will commend the work of one professor, Professor Moses Ochonu. It's unfortunate that himself and Governor Nasir El-Rufai don't get along very well, but Nasir El-Rufai could tap a lot from the work of Professor Moses Ochonu. One of them he called colonialism within colonialism, double colonialism in the Middle Belt, whereas the rest of the country, Yoruba land, Igbo land, and so on, were colonized by the British. In the case of the Middle Belt, communities that were not adherents to Islam or close to some of the cultural fabric of the Muslim communities, they needed to be colonized twice. First of all, subjugated to the northern identity, Muslim, Hausa, and so on, and then to the British. Now, the British have left. But the vestiges of the second layer of that colonialism remains. So what you call the clash is an attempt to continue to implement that blueprint designed by Lugard by the Muslim North and the resistance by the indigenes. So it is not, it is, in fact, this gives you more light about the indigenes are correct, entirely correct to see it as an attempt to eliminate them. Why? Because for you to establish a homogeneous North that speaks one language, that adheres to one religion, that has one outlook, a kind of a total wipeout of diversity, you need to commit genocide. And so anyone who says there's an attempt to commit genocide against the indigenes is correct. But in the process, the aggressors, you know, the law of nature, self-defense, nobody can make a law against. If somebody comes and holds you this way, you punch at him. So occasionally you find the Muslims being killed as well. That's why I call them dispossessing identity victims. Whereas the other one, the indigenous, I call them dispossessed identity victims, structurally. So that's how I'll throw light about how to understand what is happening. So I guess you can draw deductions from that.
I think, all right. Dr. Kajit is raising his hands once more. Kajit, can you make it brief, please?
Yes. Straight to solutions. Let me begin by saying that in my research, I analyzed the attempts to find solutions in the past. And I categorize those attempts as a complete failure in the past, in the present, and in the future, because nothing can stand on nothing. Nothing, when there is no foundation, nothing can stand. Ex nihil, nihil fit, as they say in Latin. So I identified 3 measures that have been deployed to build peace, not just in Kaduna, but in Nigeria, in the Middle Belt. The security measures, deployment, pre-conflict, during conflict, and post-conflict. The judicial measures, commissions of inquiry, court trials, and so on. And the conciliatory measures, where you have signing of peace agreements, meetings, and saying, oh, we love each other, and everyone returns without the real issues being touched. And what happens? Within a short time, everything goes in blazes. Now, the essence of this first point is to show that the efforts being focused on have not worked and are not likely to work. They are based on a post-conflict idea of peace building. They are not interested in touching the root issues. Secondly, we have some suggestions that are being made. First, state creation. About this, it may work to an extent, But you remember, this issue is beyond Southern Kaduna. It's even encroaching deep into Zamfara and so on. So state creation may bring limited succor, which will be great to some, to many. Others have talked about the idea of defining indigenship and settlership more clearly. This is a very important point within the existing framework, but it's not the ultimate solution. Within the existing framework, the definition of indigents and settlers is so mixed up that anybody can move in anywhere. And like the recent residency law that El-Rufai is, the governor, His Excellency El-Rufai, is trying to bring into force in Kaduna State only, to the exclusion of all other states in the country. You can come from anywhere, reside for some time, go and register as a resident, and that is the basis for your recognition. All indigenship is ipso facto abolished. Now, in the present constitutional structure, there is ample opening for the elimination, genocidal annihilation of entire ethnic groups based on the framework that exists. The law is not equipped to protect anyone. And it's, in fact, it is a catalyst for conflict. It allows anyone to go anywhere and claim anything. And of course, you know that those who belong there will fight. And in many cases, there are double standards that has been indicated by one of the speakers. Now, my idea of a solution is not even the idea of a clumsy articulation of restructuring. As a constitutional lawyer and a political philosopher, I have seen the different articulations of restructuring, the CONFAB 2014, the APC report on True Federalism 2018, chaired by my governor, Nasir El-Rufai, as well. Now, these two have a serious loophole as far as Southern Kaduna is concerned, which I indicated in the book I mentioned and whose link I shared. I analyzed the two reports. Both reports recommend the elimination of indigenship from section 147 of the 1999 Constitution. That is an indirect legitimation of the elimination of many indigenous communities. My idea of a solution is a new constitutional framework, which is to be built upon the ruins of what we are seeing today. The present structure was built based on a racist philosophy, propounded by people we know very well. I named Flora Shaw as the #1 person, Lugard as the next. The people who are trying to implement that today are merely secondary to the real primary coiners of this philosophy of extermination and homogenization. What is needed is a new socio-political construct and a new constitutional order in which every distinct identity is recognized as a full human, respected and recognized in the Constitution. And that will mean doing away with the nation-state construct and coming up with a state construct in which every identity will see itself protected directly, expressly, explicitly. And there are many works in this, and this is why in my work, you see me talking about the plurinational constitutional design. With this design, the state is bound. Even the very nature, the architecture, the cartography of the state, the political cartography or mapping, and the structures of governance are fashioned in such a way that these problems are eliminated entirely. Let me stop at that. So that's what my solution would be. Thank you.